The intake form reached my station at 6:11 on a standard cycle morning, routed through the overnight queue the way all transfer classification holds were routed. Flagged yellow, sitting at the bottom of the stack beneath 17 ordinary cadets whose profiles had cleared automated pre-screening without anomaly. 16 of those 17 had been processed while I slept. The 17th had stalled the pre-screening engine entirely and been escalated to my desk with a single annotation in the comments field. Human, recommend manual review. I had seen that annotation twice before in my 6 years as a proctoring operator for the Tessering Classification Engine at Vel-Orrath Consolidated Academy. The first time, it had meant nothing more than a data entry gap. The automated intake had failed to pull the subject's colony world combat record, and a technician had flagged it for manual review because that was the path of least resistance. The second time, it had meant the subject's neural resonance baseline was so far outside the standard Vel-Orrath physiological model that the pre-screening algorithm simply could not generate a confidence interval. That cadet, a man named Hollies, from a frontier mining settlement on a moon I had also needed to look up, built like load-bearing architecture, with the flat eyes of someone who had grown up treating cave-ins as a weather event, had gone through the full battery in 41 minutes, scored high competent in 4 of the 7 Tessering categories, and been assigned to logistical command without incident. I had expected something similar when I opened the file for Dara Mwangi. What I found instead was a profile the pre-screening algorithm had tried to resolve 17 times before routing it to me. Each attempt had returned the same result. The algorithm could not determine which single category to assign her, not because she was deficient in any of them, because she was not deficient in any of them. The pre-screen used a cascade model. It tested for category fit in descending probability order, and the moment a candidate's primary signal exceeded threshold for category 1, it stopped testing the rest. With Dara Mwangi, the cascade had run through all 7 categories in sequence, and found that every single category threshold had been exceeded. Then it had looked for the strongest signal to make a primary assignment. It had found 7 signals of approximately equal magnitude. It had looped 17 times trying to select among them, and eventually given up and sent her to me. I read the rest of the file before I called her in. That took longer than reading a file usually takes. Dara Mwangi, 28 years old by human reckoning, born on a colony world called Kessler's Edge, which I had to look up in the Expansion Zone Settlement Registry. It was a world in the outer band of the Terran Expansion Zone, established 41 years ago, which meant it had been operating for approximately 13 years when she was born. The colony's threat index in the registry was listed as 4.7 on the Pelloran scale, high-complexity survival environment, within the range where the ambient conditions of ordinary life produced, in the people who survived them, skill sets that Vel-Orrath's curriculum spent years trying to teach in controlled training environments. The biographical summary noted that the colony had experienced 3 settlement-threatening events in Dara's lifetime: a geological destabilization when she was 9, an ecological cascade failure when she was 16, and a first contact event with a previously uncharted species when she was 22. She was listed as a documented participant in the organized response to all 3. Her formal education record was thin in the way that expansion zone colony records were often thin, not because nothing had been learned, but because what was learned did not travel through the kinds of institutions that generated the paperwork that registries counted. 2 years of correspondence coursework completed at a Federation distance school, a provisional medical certification, a provisional structural engineering certification, an entry that read Emergency Response Coordinator, Colony Council of Kessler's Edge, years 23 through 27, with a footnote referencing 4 separate commendations from the Colonial Administration Office for Incident Management during those years. Then, at 27, She had applied to Vel-Orrath Consolidated. The application essay was in the file. I read it twice, which I had never done with an application essay before. It was 8 sentences long. It said, in clear and direct language, that she had spent 4 years coordinating emergency response for a colony of 1,200 people, had found that work satisfying but limited in scope, and wanted formal training in galactic-scale systems management, infrastructure resilience, and cross-species operational coordination. She acknowledged that she was behind her incoming cohort in theoretical background. She was prepared to work. She did not ask for accommodations or special consideration of any kind. The essay had the quality of a document written by someone who had thought carefully about what they needed to say, and then said only that, and stopped. I set the file down. I looked at the empty classification staging room through the observation window, the high-backed chair with its neutral upholstery, the neural contact headset mounted on its suspension arm above it, the 7 display surfaces arranged around the operator's station that I used to monitor the engine's readouts in real time. The room was clean and quiet. The status light above the door was white, which meant the engine was idle and ready. I activated the intercom to the intake waiting area and called her name. She came through the corridor door 30 seconds later. She was shorter than I had expected. That was the first thing I noticed, which was professionally irrelevant, and I noted it only because the gap between the expectation and the reality registered. The 4 years of emergency coordination and the 3 settlement crises and the 8 careful sentences had built, somewhere in my reading, a particular outline of a person. She did not match the outline in any obvious physical way. She was medium height for a human, which put her shorter than most Vel-Orrath students, with close-cropped dark hair and a calm face that had the particular quality of faces that have made a decision about their own expression, and then kept it consistently. She wore the standard gray transfer cadet uniform without any modification. She carried nothing into the room. She said good morning in standard galactic as she came through the door, the phrasing clean and the accent neutral, the way someone speaks a shared language they have used for practical purposes for a long time. I went through the session format with her. The Tessering engine ran 7 sequential category assessments, each delivered as a simulated scenario through the neural contact headset. The scenarios were drawn from the engine's calibrated library at the Vel-Orrath entry level. Each category assessment ran until the engine had gathered sufficient data to assign a primary score within that category. Total session time for a standard incoming cadet was between 35 and 60 minutes. The engine's output would determine her academic track placement, her initial clearance tier, and her first semester course assignment. I told her the session was confidential in both directions. I would not be sharing specific scenario content with her afterward, and she was asked not to share specific scenario content with other cadets. She asked 2 questions. First, could she see the scoring rubric? No, I told her the rubric was proprietary to the engine and classified at the assessment level to prevent preparation bias. She nodded in a way that suggested this was exactly the answer she had expected, and she found it professionally reasonable. Second, was there a water dispenser in the room? There was one at the near wall, I told her, and pointed to it. She looked at it, looked back at me, and nodded. Then she crossed to the chair, sat down, and fitted the neural contact headset herself, without any guidance. This was not typical. The contact array was not standard human interface hardware. It had been designed for a Vel-Orrath physiological baseline, and most human cadets needed positioning assistance from me or a technician before the contacts achieved a reliable interface quality. She did it on the first attempt. Either she had done her research on the headset specifications in advance, or she had looked at it for the 2 seconds it took to sit down and worked it out from the geometry. Both explanations seemed equally plausible. She settled into the chair, arranged her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes. Because the neural contact worked better that way, and she apparently already knew this. "Ready," she said. I initialized the engine. The Tessering Classification Engine was not an instrument that any single person had designed. No one living had designed it. It had been developed by the Vel-Orrath Institute of Applied Cognition over approximately 200 standard years, beginning as a behavioral profiling tool and evolving, across generations of iteration and refinement, into something considerably more complex. By the time I became a proctoring operator, it had long since passed the threshold at which any single mind could fully map what it was doing at any given moment. I could read its outputs. I could observe its decision logic in broad structural terms. I could intervene at defined checkpoints, and I had protocols for approximately 40 categories of anomalous session event. What I could not do was trace every thread of its assessment methodology in real time. No one could. The Institute's position was that this was not a problem, because the engine's outputs were accurate. In 16 years of continuous operation under current parameters, its placement recommendations had been confirmed correct by subsequent academic performance in 94.7% of cases. That was the best reliability figure any classification instrument in the consolidated system had ever produced, and the Institute regarded it with appropriate institutional pride. In 6 years of operating it, I had never had reason to doubt that figure. The first category assessment was Tier 1, Strategic Cognition. The engine generated packages of command decision problems, fleet logistics under variable constraint, multivariable optimization under incomplete information, resource allocation with competing priorities and time pressure. These were the problems that the Academy's command track spent its first year teaching cadets to approach methodically. A strong Tier 1 candidate solved them with the fluency that came from deep categorical expertise, fast identification of the core variable, confident allocation of attention across competing factors, clean output with appropriate acknowledgement of uncertainty. A candidate who was competent in Tier 1 but primarily specialized elsewhere showed a characteristic pattern, slightly slower, with more lateral processing visible in the neural signal trace, arriving at correct answers through reasoning that was efficient for a non-specialist but recognizably different in texture from a category, one mind at work. The engine was very good at distinguishing between those two patterns. That was, in large part, the point of the engine. What I was looking for, watching the Tier 1 session data populate in real time on my monitoring surface, was the specific shape of how a candidate engaged with the first problem in the batch. The moment before any pattern recognition could activate, when the mind was encountering the problem fresh, and the engine could see clearly whether it was dealing with something familiar or something being constructed from first principles. That initial shape was the engine's most reliable early signal, and it had taken me years of observation to read it fluently, and I had never once seen it produce an ambiguous result in a Tier 1 session. Dara's Tier 1 session lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I watched the engine's confidence curve on my primary display surface. It hit the primary category threshold at the 3-minute mark, which was fast. I had seen a Tier 1 complete in under 3 minutes once, for a cadet from the Vel-Orrath mathematics track who had been solving logistics problems since adolescence. What I had not seen was what happened in the final 77 seconds of that assessment. The engine, having reached primary category threshold, began the standard transition protocol toward Tier 2. But before it completed the transition, it flagged a secondary observation. The subject's Tier 1 response profile did not match the distribution expected from a strategic cognition specialist. It matched the distribution expected from a subject with broad high competency across multiple domains who had been solving strategic cognition problems. The flag appeared as a yellow advisory in my monitoring panel, not a stop condition, not a request for intervention. An annotation. The engine was nodding something and moving on. I read it. I noted it. I did not intervene. Yellow advisories were routine. They indicated that the engine had encountered something outside its primary model but had a path forward. Tier 2. Resource Systems. Scenario packages built around supply chain logistics, infrastructure management under scarcity, improvised material triage, construction prioritization under constraint. Problems that a strong Category 2 candidate, an engineer track cadet, a logistics specialist, someone who had spent formative years learning to build things that worked out of whatever was available, solved with the particular efficiency that made their category membership obvious. The engine tracked not only whether the answers were correct, but how the subject arrived at them. The architecture of the reasoning, the order of consideration, the places where a mind that had grown up thinking about systems paused, and the places where it moved without pausing, because certain things were so obvious to it that pausing would have been a kind of waste. There was a characteristic signature to strong Category 2 response patterns that I recognized after years of watching them. It was a kind of confident economy with materials, a speed in identifying which constraints were load-bearing and which were negotiable, a refusal to waste analytical attention on variables that experience had already resolved. A strong Category 2 candidate looked at a resource scarcity scenario, and the first thing their neural signal trace showed was not computation but recognition. They had seen the shape of this problem before, in different specific form, and their mind went directly to the class of solution, rather than rebuilding the solution from first principles. That was what expertise looked like in the engine's readouts. Not knowledge, pattern familiarity that had been practiced until it became instant. The bio notes in Dara's file mentioned an ecological cascade failure at age 16. A colony of 1,200 people, an agricultural and supply infrastructure suddenly unable to support itself. A 16-year-old who had grown up watching the people around her manage tight resources in a survival environment. I thought about that while I watched the Tier 2 session data populate. Dara's Tier 2 session lasted 4 minutes and 51 seconds. Yellow advisory. Language nearly identical to the first. Subject's Tier 2 response profile does not match Category 2 specialist distribution. Subject response profile is consistent with high competency across multiple domains who is solving resource systems problems. I was 9 minutes into the session. In 6 years, I had seen back-to-back yellow advisories with this specific signature, not anomalous response, but anomalous breadth exactly 0 times. I did not intervene. I sat forward in my chair and I read each advisory carefully and I moved the session forward, because the engine was operating within its design parameters. The yellow advisories were its way of keeping me informed. They were not its way of asking me to stop. Tier 3. Social systems. Negotiation scenarios. Multi-faction dynamics. Coalition construction under competing interests. Conflict de-escalation in high-stakes environments where every party had legitimate concerns and no clean outcome was available. This was the category that the Academy's diplomatic affairs track considered its primary domain, and it was also the category where most candidates from frontier colony environments showed their most significant drop. Not because they were unintelligent. The colonies produced plenty of intelligent people, but because the cognitive patterns that frontier survival rewarded were patterns built for physical and logistical problem-solving, for environments where the most urgent question was usually how to keep infrastructure and bodies intact, not how to manage the competing claims of parties who were all present in the same room and all needed to leave feeling heard. The Academy's diplomatic affairs faculty had a standard observation about Category 3 performance that I had heard often enough to have it memorized. A person who learned everything they know about the world from environments that punish delay learns to move quickly through problems. And quick movement is sometimes exactly what a social negotiation will not survive. It was a sound observation. I had seen it proven repeatedly in classification sessions. A strong Category 1 candidate working through Tier 3 material often showed the characteristic texture the diplomatic affairs faculty was describing. The fast lateral move to what looked like a solution. The response that optimized for one party's outcome without adequately accounting for the relational cost. The kind of answer that was technically correct if you were trying to resolve a situation in the near term, and did not care what the parties thought of each other afterward. The engine scored those responses appropriately. Not wrong, the scenarios were not designed to have a single correct answer, but distinctively shaped, in a way that told the engine something about how the candidate's primary category was expressed. I was watching for that texture when Dara's Tier 3 data began populating the monitoring display. I did not find it. What I found instead was a response pattern that the engine's real-time annotation flagged as showing simultaneous optimization across multiple criteria that experienced diplomatic affairs practitioners typically reported learning to wait in sequence, because learning to hold all of them at once took time. Managing the stated position while tracking the relational cost, allowing for what the other party needed to be seen to receive versus what they were willing to accept. Reading the pace of a conversation as a variable to be managed rather than a fixed condition. These were things the Academy's diplomatic affairs curriculum spent months teaching. They were things experienced negotiators described as intuition when they were actually disciplined multi-track attention, developed over years of practice. The engine flagged a pattern consistent with that multi-track attention in Dara Mwanga's Tier 3 responses at the 4-minute mark. Dara's Tier 3 session lasted 5 minutes and 4 seconds. Yellow advisory. I was leaning forward against my display console at that point, both forearms on the surface, because at some point in the preceding 14 minutes the position I was sitting in had changed without my consciously deciding to change it. 3 consecutive yellow advisories, all with the same core language, all pointing in the same direction. I had been briefed, when I first became a proctoring operator, on the full range of anomalous session events the engine could produce. The briefing document had been thorough. It had described, as a theoretical possibility with low expected operational frequency, a subject whose profile did not fit a single category because their competency was distributed across multiple categories simultaneously. A profile the document called, in a footnote, an integrated generalist. The footnote had noted that such profiles had been documented in historical literature from the early human expansion period. It had noted that the pattern was not represented in current training data. It had noted that if such a profile were encountered in an operational session, the operator should proceed carefully and maintain full monitoring. I had read that footnote and moved on. That was 3 years ago. The footnote had not felt like information I would ever need. Tier 4 was ethical systems, moral reasoning under structured pressure, scenarios without clean outcomes, resource allocation that required choosing among competing legitimate claims, none of which could be fully honored, authority hierarchies that contained internal contradictions that could not all be resolved without violating at least one governing principle. Problems of a kind the Academy's ethics faculty used to argue about in staff meetings, because even they could not agree on the correct answer. The engine used Tier 4 not as a primary category assignment tool. Most candidates did not specialize in ethical systems, but as a layering assessment, a way of determining where a candidate's decision-making framework would place them when they reached the highest-order operations within their primary category. It was not designed to find ethical specialists. It was designed to understand how a candidate's ethics shaped their specialized competency. Dara's Tier 4 session lasted 6 minutes and 12 seconds. No yellow advisory, red flag. My hands were on the manual override controls before I had consciously decided to put them there. A red flag could mean the session needed to be terminated. It could mean a hardware fault in the neural contact interface. It could mean the subject was in physiological distress of some kind. I checked the biometric readouts, which the headset collected continuously and fed to a secondary display surface. Heart rate, respiration rate, skin conductance, neural galvanic stress response. Dara's heart rate was 68 beats per standard minute. Her respiration was slow and regular. Her skin conductance was flat. Her neural galvanic stress response was flat. She was, by every measurement the headset could take, sitting in a comfortable chair and engaging with something she found intellectually absorbing. I read the red flag annotation. Tier 4 primary result. Subject response profile does not fit Category 4 specialist distribution. Subject response profile does not fit Category 4 non-specialist distribution. Response profile exceeds reference library upper bound for Tier 4 scenarios delivered at standard entry-level calibration. Scenario difficulty elevated to Track 3 certification level. Please confirm. The engine was asking my permission to escalate. In 6 years of operation, the engine had never asked my permission to escalate scenario difficulty. It managed its own calibration. That was part of its design. For it to surface this request to me meant that the escalation it was proposing was outside the range it was authorized to perform without human sign-off. Track 3 certification scenarios were not entry-level problems. They were the problems used to assess third-year cadets for advanced academic placement, problems that even experienced cadets found difficult, that the Academy's most senior instructors debated the appropriate framing of, that were calibrated for minds that had spent 3 years being systematically tested and refined. Dara Mwangi had been in the classification chair for 26 minutes. She had not yet completed the Academy's orientation week. I confirmed. She was in the chair for another 40 minutes after that, and I watched all of it. The engine ran her through Track 3 Tier 4 scenarios for 11 minutes. Then it looped back, which was also something I had not seen it do, and ran her through Track 3 Tier 2 scenarios for 8 minutes to verify the earlier Tier 2 data at elevated difficulty. Then it ran a Track 3 Tier 1 verification for 6 minutes. Then it ran a combined scenario set that the engine apparently constructed on its own. I had not known it could do that, and I have looked at the technical documentation several times since, and I still cannot find a clear description of the procedure it used, drawing from all 4 completed tiers simultaneously and generating problems that could not be solved correctly using only one category's expertise. Problems that required strategic cognition, resource systems competency, social systems awareness, and ethical reasoning all at once, applied to a single scenario, because the scenario was built in such a way that using only one of those things would produce an outcome that the others would immediately recognize as wrong. I could read the high-level scenario descriptions as they generated. I should note, for the accuracy of this account, that I paused and thought about several of them. There was one scenario, a combined Tier 1 and 3 package, that presented a command-level resource allocation problem set inside a multi-faction political situation where the logistical solution and the diplomatically sustainable solution were not the same solution, and where the correct answer required finding the path that satisfied enough of each constraint to hold. I looked at that scenario description for approximately 90 seconds, working through what I thought the correct approach would be. Then I looked at the response data coming back from Dara Mwangi's session in the staging room, which the engine logged in compressed form as it received it, and I noticed that the shape of her response had addressed the thing I had identified, and several things I had not identified, in the time it had taken me to read the scenario summary. I am a proctoring operator. I am not a candidate for any of the 7 Tessering categories. I have never claimed to be exceptional at the kinds of problems the engine tests, but I have spent 6 years watching candidates work through difficult material, and I have developed a functional understanding of what expert responses to complex problems look like. I want to be precise about what I observed in those compressed response logs and what I did not observe. I did not observe speed as a primary feature. The responses were not fast in the way that a shallow response is fast, the kind of fast that comes from not engaging fully with the complexity of a problem. They were fast in the way that thorough work is sometimes fast when the person doing it has a very clear internal model of the problem space and does not have to spend time constructing that model from first principles. The time was going somewhere. It just was not going to confusion. These were not problems I had seen the engine generate before in an operational session. They were the kind of problems that, when I read the scenario descriptions on my monitoring surface, made me pause to think about whether I understood what the correct approach would be. What I watched on the engine's monitoring readouts during those 15 minutes of combined scenarios was not a single category's reasoning under pressure. It was all four of them, running in parallel, and they were not in conflict with each other. They were integrated. The strategic analysis informed the resource triage. The resource triage informed the social calculation. The social calculation informed the ethical framework. The ethical framework refined the strategic analysis. They fed each other in a loop that kept arriving at outputs that the engine's evaluation metrics kept flagging as correct, and then correct, and then correct again. The engine's confidence curves, one line per category, visible on my monitoring surface, were doing something I had not seen them do. They were not converging on a single category. They were running parallel. 7 lines, trending upward in approximately the same direction at approximately the same rate, none of them establishing a dominant lead over the others. The engine was not finding a primary category. It was finding a candidate for whom all 7 categories kept becoming simultaneously more clearly indicated, with every additional data point it collected. At minute 57 from the start of the session, I called my supervisor. Her name was Prex Valoon. She was a senior proctoring administrator, 2 tiers above my position, with 23 years at Vel-Orrath. She had certified the current version of the Tessering engine documentation and had been present for the engine's last major operational update 11 years ago. I called her private comm channel because I did not want to route through the department line, and I did not want to explain in text what I was looking at. I wanted her in the room. She answered on the second signal. I said her name. I said she should come to classification room 4. I said it in a tone that conveyed the situation was unusual without specifying how. She knew my voice. She said she would be there. She arrived in the observation room 6 minutes later. I watched her cross the floor and take a position at my right shoulder, and she read the monitoring display surface without speaking. The 7 parallel curves. The combined scenario session. The biometric readouts showing Dara Mwanga's heart rate at 66 beats per minute. It had been 68 when we started, 68 or 69 through most of the session, and it had dropped 2 points sometime in the last 15 minutes, as if the cognitive demands of the override scenario package were settling her into something deeper than her resting state. I watched Prex Valoon's face as she read the monitoring display. I have known her for 6 years, and she is not a person whose expressions travel very far. But she read the display for 2 minutes without speaking, and during that 2 minutes she went through the session log, the current scenario description, the 7 probability curves, and the running engine annotation log in the side panel. The annotation at minute 16 was, response profile integration across all 7 categories is increasing with scenario difficulty rather than degrading. Standard model predicts degradation of secondary and tertiary category performance under high difficulty primary category stress. Subject is not exhibiting predicted degradation pattern. Note for post-session analysis. Prex Valoon read that annotation. Then she read the curves again. What's her background? She said. Colony World. Threat Index 4.7. Colony Emergency Response Coordinator for 4 years before this application. No formal academic track. 3 settlement crises in her developmental years. Documented participant in response to all 3. Prex Valoon was quiet for a moment. What is the engine doing right now? Looking for a ceiling, I said. It's run out of its standard protocol. It constructed a combined category scenario set on its own authority. It's been running that for 15 minutes. Is it finding a ceiling? I looked at the 7 probability curves. Not yet, I said. The engine issued its second red flag at minute 73 from the start of the session, which was minute 47 since I had confirmed the Track 3 escalation. Tier 5 assessment suspended. Subject has exceeded primary threshold in categories 1 through 4 simultaneously. Engine cannot proceed with standard sequential protocol. Manual operator decision required. Proceed to override assessment package or terminate session and refer to Institute Review Board. The override assessment package existed as a documented protocol because the people who built the engine had been thorough enough to plan for theoretical completeness. Every system should have a terminus condition. Every classification protocol should have a defined behavior for the situation in which it could not make a determination through standard means. The override package was that behavior. It ran all 7 category assessments simultaneously rather than sequentially, presenting a subject with a structured series of scenarios that required genuine multi-category integration and measuring how they handled it. The documentation noted, in the system briefing materials I had reviewed during my initial certification, that the override package had never been used in operational conditions. It had been tested against simulated profiles only. I had read that note 3 years ago. I was now looking at the confirmation prompt. I looked at Dara's biometrics. 65 beats per minute, still regular, still flat on every stress indicator. I looked at Prex Valoon. She read the confirmation prompt and then looked at me, which told me she was not going to make this decision for me and did not think it was her decision to make. I selected Proceed to Override Assessment Package. The override assessment package ran for 38 minutes. I am going to try to describe what I watched during those 38 minutes, and I am going to fail to describe it adequately, and I want to be honest about that limitation before I try. What I watched was a collection of readouts on a display surface, probability curves, and scenario metrics and biometric data, and the engine's running annotation log, which I kept visible in a side panel because I had the feeling that anything the engine chose to annotate during this session was something I needed to read in real time. That was what I was physically watching. What it was like to watch it bore no resemblance to the experience of looking at data. What it was like was watching a measurement instrument try to find the edge of something and not find it. The engine's override scenario library ran from calibration level 1 through calibration level 7. Level 1 was standard entry level. Level 7 was what the documentation called Command Certification Review Material, the problems used to evaluate whether a candidate with several years of academy training behind them was ready to take a position of substantive institutional authority. 11 years into my career, I had operated the engine through 3 command certification reviews. Those sessions had been the most demanding I had managed, for the candidates who went through them, and for me as an operator. The Level 7 scenarios were designed to find the edges of expert minds. That was their purpose. They were not designed to be answered correctly by people who had been in the chair for less than 2 hours. The override package started at Level 3, which was already above entry calibration. Dara's response pattern came back at the same texture I had been watching for the last hour. Distributed, integrated, all 7 probability curves rising in parallel. The engine escalated to Level 4 after 8 minutes. Level 4 was the calibration at which the Academy's mid-program academic reviews were conducted. The problems at Level 4 assumed familiarity with the Academy's core curriculum, not completion of it, but genuine engagement with the foundational conceptual framework of each category. Strong Level 4 performance was the standard the Academy used to determine whether a second-year cadet was on track for advanced placement or needed additional foundational coursework. It was not easy material by any ordinary measure. It was material the Academy spent a full year preparing its students to encounter. Same result, the curves kept rising. Level 5 after another 7 minutes. Level 5 was the threshold the Academy called Professional Competency Standard, the baseline expected of a candidate who was completing their formal education and entering an operational role. It was, in the Academy's own documentation, the level at which the consolidated system trusted graduates with unsupervised professional responsibility. Passing at level 5 in a given category was what made an Academy graduate employable in that category's vocational domain. It was not a high bar in the sense of being rare. Approximately 40% of Vel-Orrath's graduating class met it in their primary category each year. It was a high bar in the sense that meeting it required genuine, demonstrated competency that the Academy and the Institute both stood behind. Dara's performance at level 5 was indistinguishable in the probability curves from her performance at level 3. The curves kept rising. The integration pattern the engine had been noting in its annotation log since minute 16 kept intensifying rather than degrading. The engine escalated to level 6. I had run level 6 material in 2 of my 3 command certification sessions. The candidates who had undergone those reviews were senior cadets with 3 full years of Vel-Orrath training, both of whom had been identified as exceptional by their track instructors well before the review was scheduled. One of them had passed. The other had passed in 6 of 7 categories and been asked to return for a supplementary review in the 7th. Both of them had found the level 6 material difficult. The one who passed had told me afterward that it was the hardest thinking he had ever done in a formal setting. He had said it without self-pity. He was proud of it. But the difficulty had been real, and it had been visible in his biometric readout during the session. Dara's biometrics at level 6 were still showing 65 beats per minute and a flat galvanic response. The engine reached level 6 at minute 21 of the override package, and I called Prex Valoon over again, because she had stepped back from the console to give me operational space, and I wanted her to see the readout with her own eyes. She came over and she stood next to me, and she looked at the display surface, and I watched her read the engine's annotation log, where the engine had been making notes to itself in the side panel. The notes were technical, primarily, observations about response pattern distribution, statistical anomalies in the calibration model, requests to itself to re-verify earlier tier data against new data collected at higher calibration levels. But one annotation, logged at minute 16 of the override package, read as follows: response profile integration across all 7 categories is increasing with scenario difficulty rather than degrading. Standard model predicts degradation of secondary and tertiary category performance under high difficulty primary category stress. Subject is not exhibiting predicted degradation pattern. Note for post-session analysis. Prex Valoon read that annotation twice. She did not say anything. The engine reached level 7 at minute 26 of the override package. I had not known what I expected to see when it did. I think I had expected the curves to plateau, or to show some sign that the scenarios at this calibration were finally finding the boundary of what Dara Mwangi could sustain. People had boundaries. The Academy had been finding the boundaries of capable minds for generations. That was what the engine was for. Everyone had a ceiling. Finding ceilings was the point. At minute 32 of the override package, all 7 probability curves crossed the threshold that the engine's documentation called the professional expert designation, the level of measured competency that, in a single category, would qualify a candidate for advanced placement in the Academy's highest performing track sections. All 7 of them, simultaneously, 6 minutes into level 7 scenario calibration. Neither Prex Valoon nor I said anything for a long time after that. The curves continued climbing. The engine continued generating scenarios. There was nothing in the monitoring panel that suggested distress, either from the instrument or from the subject. Dara Mwanga's heart rate was 64 beats per minute. Her respiration was so slow, and even that I found myself checking the biometric feed for equipment fault, because it looked less like a person under cognitive demand and more like a person in a meditative resting state. Everything else the headset was measuring said the opposite. She was fully engaged. She was producing response signals of high quality and high volume. She was not resting. She was simply performing in a state of what the engine would have called, if it had those categories, deep cognitive absorption. At minute 38 of the override package, the engine terminated the session automatically. Not because it had found a primary category assignment, not because the probability curves had converged on a single category or even begun to diverge from their parallel track. The engine terminated the session because it had exhausted its scenario library at level 7. There were no more problems of appropriate calibration to give her. The override assessment package had been built to contain the most demanding classification scenarios in the engine's operational library, and the engine had run all of them, and Dara Mwangi had answered them, and the engine had nothing left to show her. The status light above the classification room door shifted from green to amber. The engine rendered its final output. I have kept a copy of that output, and I have looked at it many times since that session, because I believe it is the kind of document that warrants repeated reading. I will reproduce it exactly. Classification session complete. Primary category assignment, unable to determine. Subject response profile exceeds taxonomy boundaries of all 7 Tessering classification categories. Subject demonstrates simultaneous professional expert threshold competency in strategic cognition, resource systems, social systems, ethical systems, technical adaptation, physical systems, command authority. Note: this result does not indicate system malfunction. Review of session data confirms engine operated within normal parameters throughout. This result indicates that the subject's competency profile does not fit within the existing classification taxonomy. Recommendation: refer to Institute Review Board for manual track placement. And then, below the formal output, in the engine's notation field, a space reserved for supplementary observations that the engine flagged as potentially relevant, but outside the formal output schema, a single additional line. Note: subject profile is consistent with integrated generalist development pattern documented in historical literature from early human expansion period. Pattern is not represented in current training data. Classification taxonomy may require revision. Prex Valoon read the output over my shoulder. I gave her the time she needed. When she had finished, she stood upright and she said, very carefully, "The engine is recommending that its own taxonomy may need to be revised." "Yes," I said. "Based on one session." "Based on one session." Through the observation window, I watched Dara Mwangi reach up and lift the neural contact headset from her head. She did it without hurry, deliberately, with the careful handling of someone returning equipment in the condition they found it. She set the array down on the armrest. Then she stood. She stretched once, a long, considered stretch, arms above her head, the full extension of her spine, in the way a person stretches after sitting in one position for a substantial time. Then she looked toward the observation window, which was one-way glass from her side, and she waited in the patient way of someone who had done a thing and was prepared for whatever came next. I activated the room communication channel. "You can come through," I said. She came through the door, and she looked at me, and then at Prex Valoon, whose presence in the room she registered without apparent surprise or concern, and she stood in the way of someone who has answered every question she was asked and is now waiting to be told the result. She did not ask what the result was. She did not ask how it had gone. She had been in the chair for 137 minutes, and I think she knew, in the broad way that people who are accustomed to doing things under high-quality observation know, that something significant had happened. She waited for us to address it. There was a silence of a few seconds that I did not manage very well. The right thing to do in a classification debrief was to deliver the primary category assignment and the track placement recommendation and explain what the next steps were. I had no primary category assignment. I had no track placement recommendation. I had an output document and a supplementary annotation that I was still processing. The engine has completed its assessment, I said, which was accurate. She waited. The results require review by the Institute Review Board before a formal track placement can be issued, I said. That process typically takes 3 to 5 standard weeks. In the interim, you'll be registered as classification pending and assigned to a transitional cohort with access to general academy resources. She absorbed this without any visible sign of frustration or surprise. Is that normal? She asked. It's not common, I said. I paused. There was a longer answer to that question, and I was deciding how much of it to give her. The engine encountered some complexity in your profile that requires more detailed review than the standard output process covers. She considered this. Okay, she said. It was not a dismissal. It was the response of someone who had been given an answer that told her what she needed to know and was filing it appropriately. Then, do I need to sign anything? I looked at the output document on my display surface, the formal assessment, the supplementary notation, the blank field on the standard classification form where I was supposed to enter a primary category assignment. I thought about the paperwork involved in a referral to the Institute Review Board, which I had never done before, and which was going to require me to read documentation I had also never read before. I'll get the referral forms to you through the Academy communication system by end of cycle, I said. One acknowledgement form. The rest of the paperwork is on the Academy's end. She nodded once, filing this as well. If there's nothing else, she said, I should find out where my housing assignment is. I was told the cadet registrar handles that. Third floor administration block, I said. They open at 900. She glanced at the wall clock. It was 9:07. She had been in this room since 6:31. The cadet registrar had been open for 7 minutes. Thank you for the session, she said. She said it the way a person thanks someone who has been professionally competent, with appropriate sincerity and the appropriate weight of the thing, which was not a large weight. Then she walked out. I heard her footsteps in the corridor, steady and unhurried, going in the direction of the administration block. Prex Valoon, and I stood in the observation room for a while after the sound faded. The Institute Review Board, Prex Valoon said. Yes, I said. How long will that actually take? 3 to 5 weeks for the formal protocol. The outcome is less clear. I'll be honest, I don't know what their procedure is for a case like this. I don't know that they have one. Prex Valoon looked at the monitoring display surface for another moment. The amber status light was visible through the window above the classification room door. The engine had powered down to standby, its work concluded. The 7 probability curves were still visible on my display. Frozen at the moment the session had terminated, 7 parallel lines above the professional expert threshold, rising in the same direction, none of them dominant. When she was in the override package, Prex Valoon said, the last 10 minutes, the curves were still climbing. Yes, I said. Was there a ceiling? I thought about the level 7 scenarios. I thought about the engine exhausting its library. I thought about the supplementary annotation. The engine ran out of problems, I said, before it found one. Prex Valoon was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to want a copy of the full session log. I'll send it by midday. She nodded. She took her tablet from the console edge where she had set it when she arrived and tucked it under her arm. She looked at the monitoring display one more time. Then she walked out without saying anything else, and her footsteps went in the direction of her office, which was in the administrative wing where senior academy staff spent their mornings working through things that required sustained attention. I sat down at the operator's console. The session output was on the display surface. The 7 curves, the final assessment, the notation field with its single additional line. I had a report to write. The registrar's office expected a standard session summary by end of cycle, even for referral cases. The Institute Review Board expected a formal referral package within 3 standard days. There were forms I did not yet know the location of, procedures I had not yet read, and a blank field on the classification form that I was going to have to leave blank and explain to 7 separate administrative systems that had been designed with the assumption that it would never be left blank. I opened a new document. I typed the date, the session identification number, the subject's name. Then I sat for a while, looking at the empty body of the document. The session was, by any conventional measure, complete. The engine had run. The data had been collected. The output had been rendered. The protocol had been followed correctly at every step. I had escalated when the engine asked me to escalate. I had confirmed the override package when the engine asked for confirmation. The session log would show that the proctoring operator had exercised appropriate judgment at each decision point. None of that was in question. What was in question was what to write in the body of the report, because I was finding that the standard language of a session summary, a form I had filled out 3,000 times in 6 years, did not have vocabulary that was equal to what had happened in classification room for that morning. The form had fields for primary category assignment, track placement recommendation, notable performance flags, and additional operator notes. Primary category assignment was blank. Track placement was pending Institute review. The performance flags field was going to need to contain a reference to an event that had never happened before in the engine's operational history. The additional operator notes field was where I was going to have to say something true about what I had witnessed, in language that the review board and the registrar and whatever administrators eventually read this document would be able to act on, and that would still be accurate when someone read it 5 years from now. I had the distinct and not entirely comfortable sense that I was about to write a document that would be cited in meetings I would not be present for. I was going to write that she was unclassifiable because that was what the engine had determined and it was accurate and the report had to say something true. I was going to file the referral and the registrar would assign her to the transitional cohort and the Institute Review Board would convene at whatever schedule they convened on, and the academy would continue operating as it always operated. There would be meetings. There would be documentation. Something would happen next, in the orderly and procedurally appropriate way that things at Vel-Orrath always happen next. But while all of that was proceeding, Dara Mwangi was going to be somewhere in the academy, classified pending, with access to the general library and the transitional cohort's course materials. And based on what I had spent the last 137 minutes observing, I had a reasonable estimate of what she was going to do with that access. She was going to use it. She was going to use all of it, and probably efficiently. And the academy's administrative systems were going to continue trying to find a drawer to put her in while she moved through the institution doing whatever she found most useful to do. Outside the window, the amber status light continued to glow above the classification room door, waiting for someone to tell it what to do next. I had not reset the room yet. The chair was empty. The headset was on its armrest where she had placed it, the contact array folded correctly, returned in the condition it had been in at the start of the session. The scenario library had been logged and archived. The session was complete. I thought about what the engine had said in its supplementary notation. Pattern is not represented in current training data. Classification taxonomy may require revision. I thought about what it would take to revise the Tessering Classification taxonomy. I thought about the 200 years of institutional investment that taxonomy represented, and the 94.7% accuracy rate, and the 3,000 candidates I had personally run through a system that had worked correctly for every one of them. The system had worked correctly this morning too. That was the accurate thing to say about it. It had not failed. It had encountered something it had not been built to classify, and it had said so honestly, and that was as much as you could ask of any instrument. I reached over and reset the room status. The amber light went back to white. I began to type. I chose my words with more care than I usually chose words, because I had the clear and settled sense, the kind of sense that does not announce itself dramatically but simply arrives, the way correct conclusions arrive when a problem has been fully worked, that whatever I wrote in this document was going to matter for longer than one administrative cycle. I wrote that the session had proceeded within normal operational parameters. I wrote that the engine had operated correctly throughout. I wrote that the subject's response profile had exceeded the taxonomy boundaries of all 7 classification categories simultaneously, a result the engine had not previously produced in operational conditions, and that the supplementary notation from the engine's output was attached in full. I wrote that a referral to the Institute Review Board was being filed under the standard anomalous result protocol, and that the board was respectfully invited to note that the anomaly was not in the subject's performance, but in the taxonomy's capacity to contain it. Then I looked at that last sentence for a moment and left it in, because it was true, and the review board was going to read the session log anyway and come to the same conclusion on their own, and there was no reason to be imprecise about what the data showed. I wrote the rest, and when I was done I read it through once and did not change it. Outside, somewhere in the administration block, Dara Mwangi was getting a room number and would shortly be finding the library terminals and making whatever assessments she made about the resources available to her and how to deploy the time she had until the review board produced a result. Somewhere in the Academy's record systems, a transitional cohort was gaining a member who would be difficult to characterize on the standard forms. Somewhere in the Institute's documentation library, a footnote about integrated generalists was about to become something more than a footnote. The next candidate was waiting in the intake area. I checked the time. I had enough of the morning left to run 2 more sessions before the midday break, and both of them had cleared pre-screening without any anomaly, which meant they would be straightforward and quick, and by the end of the afternoon I would have a completed referral package ready to send to the Institute. Both of those sessions would produce a clean primary category assignment. The form fields would be filled correctly. The placement would be issued. The candidates would know what they were and where they were going, and the Academy would have 2 more names in the right columns of the right ledgers. That was how it was supposed to work. I called the next candidate's name. The white light held steady over classification room 4. The engine was ready.